Hello, my dear students. How are you? I hope that all of you are very fine. Be hopeful, be positive, and stay safe at your homes. Now, let us read the second chapter of supplementary reader, The Address, written by Marga Minko. Today, we shall discuss on the question answers of this chapter because yesterday already we have studied the summary of this lesson. My dear students, see, the first question is, have you come back? Said the woman. I thought that no one had come back. Does this statement give some clue about the story? If yes, what is it? So now, first of all, you will have to remember whose statement is this. This statement is of a woman. Who is that woman? That woman is Mrs. Darling, the friend of Mrs. S. Who is Mrs. S? Mrs. S is the mother of the narrator. Already I have told you that this story has been set in the time when Holland was at war, and in that time Mrs. S was living in a rented room in Holland, and she thought that she might have to leave the house, the place. That is why she allowed her friend Mrs. Darling to take every valuable things from her house to her own house. Why? Why did she allow this? She allowed this so that her belongings, her things must be lie in safety. That is why Mrs. Darling was coming every day or alternately day, and she was taking one thing and the other from her house. But unfortunately, the mother of the narrator, Mrs. S, died in the war. So the narrator left that house and she went to the other place and she began to live in a very small rented room. And one day she thought, or she was longing to have the belongings of her mother, to see them, to feel them, to touch them. That is why when this idea overpowered on her mind, she decided to go to the address room number 46 and Marconi Street. Why she remembered this address? Because Mrs. Darling was living in that locality, in that room, in that house number 46. When she went there and she knocked on the door, Mrs. Darling opened the door and she saw the narrator. She was struck, she was stunned and shocked, and automatically, spontaneously means automatically, apne aap, these sounds came from her mouth, these words came from her mouth. She said, have you come back? She said this because she thought that not only Mrs. S but her daughter had also died in the war. That is why she was living freely, and she never thought that anybody would come to her house to ask for the belongings of Mrs. S. So this is the main reason. She thought that both the mother and the daughter had died in the war. And does this statement give some clue about the story? Yes. This statement gives a clue about the story, clue of the war. When she asked, "Have you come back?" she thought that she had died in the war. This statement gives the clue of the war and the death of the mother of the narrator. This is the answer of the first question. And the second question is, the story is divided into pre-war and post-war times. What hardships do you think the girl underwent during these times? Pre-war time and post-war time. Pre-war time means before the war, the time before the war. And post-war time is the time after the war. Pre-war time means time before the war. And post-war time means time after the war. Time before the war and time after the war. So what hardships? Hardships means difficulties. What hardships or what difficulties had to be undergo? Undergo means to bear, सहन करना, to tolerate. To bear, to tolerate. What hardships had to be tolerated to the narrator? Before the time when the narrator came back to her house for a few days, she saw that the friend of her mother was coming alternately to her house, and she was taking one thing and the other thing from her house. So she did not like it, and she was not consented to it. She was not agreed with it. But she dared not to ask the question. She dared not to make the objection against this work because she was fearing of the mother. This was the hardship, that she was losing her belongings one by one, but she could not make the objection against it. She could not object it. This was the difficulty before pre-war time. And what was the difficulty post-war time? Means after the war. That she had to lose her mother, she had to lose her home or house where she was living, and she had to live her life, she had to survive her life all alone. And when an idea came in her mind to go to see the belongings of her mother to the house of Mrs. Darling, she saw that Mrs. Darling refused to recognize her. Recognize means to identify, पहचानना. तो वो देखी कि Mrs. Darling refused to recognize her, and she said that she would see another time. That is why the narrator came back to her place again, and one day again this idea came in her mind to go there. So when she went to visit the house of Mrs. Darling for the second time, so she saw that the girl, means the daughter of Mrs. Darling, took her very modestly in her house, and when she saw that all the things were lying around the room in sixes and sevens in disordered way. Then she decided to forget that address, and she never went to go there again. And in this way, she came back from the house hopelessly, helplessly, to her rented house, and she survived very difficultly her life. So this is the answer of the second question. And my dear students, the third question is, why did the narrator of the story want to forget the address? So, the narrator of the story wanted to forget the address because when she came back to her house before the war, she saw that Mrs. Darling was taking one thing and the other thing from her house day by day. At that time, when she tried to make the objection to her mother, the mother scolded her and she stared at her. Then, at that time, her mother told the address, house number 46, Marconi Street, so that after the war or in the war, if the narrator loses her mother, she could go to that address. And that was that. ऐसा ही हुआ. That was that means ऐसा ही हुआ. During the war, she lost her mother and she hired a rented room. And one day, when she decided to go to this address, house number 46, Marconi Street, in order to see, feel, touch the belongings of her mother, so she saw that for the first time, Mrs. Darling refused to recognize her, refused to identify her, and she gave another time. The narrator came back to her house again, and when for the second time she visited the house of Mrs. Darling, she saw that all the things belonging to her mother were lying around the room, and she recognized the Hanukkah, the candle holder, candle stand, the woolen cloth, the kettle, the fork, spoon, box, and other things. But she saw that all these things were lying, were put carelessly, and she saw that Mrs. Darling and her daughter were not ready to give these things back to her. So she saw that, so she means here the narrator. The narrator thought that in earlier time or before the war, all these belongings were separated by her mother to Mrs. Darling. So all these things are not belonging to her, and she decided to leave all these things. And the other reason, she said that her house, rented house, was very small. It was not spacious to have all these things inside, and that is why, for these two reasons, she decided to forget the address. So this is the answer of the third question, my dear students. And the fourth question is, the address is a story of human predicament that follows war. This is the story of human predicament that follows the war. So now, see the meaning of predicament. Predicament means hardships, difficulties. Hardships, difficulties. So really, the war follows the human predicaments. This is natural. because during the war there is loss of a lot human beings, a lot prosperity and wealth, a lot animals, birds, etc., because the bullet does not recognize any person. That is why we can surely say that the war follows the human predicament, the human hardships, because the human beings lose their wealth, their prosperity, their relatives, their mother, father, sons, wives, etc. So all these predicaments follow the war. Follow the war means these things come after the war. These things fall after the war. So it is natural, because we have seen the First World War, we have seen the Second World War. The First World War lost so many prosperity, wealth and other things. The Second World War also, and now you can see that atmosphere of the Third World War is being created by some powerful countries. So war is never a good thing, and it never follows the happiness, the peace of mind, etc. And in this way, the questions of the comprehension given in your book have been discussed by me, and if there is any problem, you will ask the question, I will give the answer when we shall meet face to face. That is all. Thank you, my dear students.